Well, the real question is the God of the universe wants to speak to you, but how do you recognize his voice? I'm sure back when I was in high school and even right before I came, one of the questions that I always had was, does God even communicate to us anymore? Does the God want to speak to us? And if he does want to speak, does he want to speak to me? Will he answer my questions? And will I ever know the difference between his voice, my voice, and the enemy's voice? Those are all very pertinent questions that we got to think about, and I'm sure some of you guys have thought about those before. But more so than just knowing whether we can hear his voice is, what do you think his voice sounds like? Well, I think my phone's ringing here.
Is it? Weird. Oh. What's it saying?
Oh, hey, God. Yeah. Thanks for giving me a call.
Speed dial, huh?
Yeah, speed dial.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll be there around 2. Yeah, we can grab a bite to eat. No, God's not on the phone, okay? God's not going to call you. He's not going to post on your Facebook wall. But if he did, what would be his name? What do you think his name would be? Let's think of some of the names that God has for us put in the Bible that he says that are his name, that he has given to us to think about and to reflect on. He calls himself Father in John 14:6. He calls himself our friend in James 2:23. He is our lover, and he refers to that in Revelation 1:5. He's our strength in Psalms 18:1. He's our counselor. He's our provider. He's our comforter. He's the chosen one. He's our shepherd. And he's our servant, because he subjected himself and was humble to be servant of all, so that we could have life in him.
You know, and it's important for us to understand that God is speaking. You know, we talk about these questions that we ask ourselves. We ask, like, you know, is God speaking? I think that's his biggest challenge. And even down here, people have constantly been really seeking God and God's voice. And, you know, what does God want for me? What is God's plan for me? What should I do? What is he, you know, like there's been a lot of seeking of God and saying, you know, God, I need you to speak to me. And it's really important for us to get to that point, knowing that God is speaking. You know, we see God spoke the creation into being. Like in Genesis chapter 1, I think it's 11 times it says God said. God said. 11 different times God spoke creation into being, and it was good. He spoke things like, you know, the moon, the stars. I mean, look at it. 11 different times God said. And so we see that from the very beginning, God speaks and things happen. And later throughout creation, later throughout the Bible, we see how God starts sending people, and he's speaking to people, and he's reaching different ways and applying different things.
Absolutely. But why does he want to speak to us? I mean, I think many Christians just think that God came to save us from hell, and now he dipped out and says, okay, just be good until you come to heaven. But he wants so much more than just to save us. He wants to spend each day with us, walking with us through life. And that's why he has these names for us that he gave us, because he's our friend, he's our lover. He wants to comfort us. He wants to be there for us and provide for us. But how can we be these things for him if we don't have a relationship with him? And that's what we're here to talk about. Because I know Janae's probably out there, my little sister. If her best friend, whoever it is right now, I don't want to put her on the spot. You know what I mean? But if she gets a call from her best friend, she knows automatically who it is. Oh, hey, blah, 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 blah. Knows exactly who it is before she even checks the name on the screen. Why? Yeah, exactly. You know why? Because she spent enough time with that person to know what her voice sounds like. And that's what we want with God. So how do you get familiar with God's voice, Adam?
See, and that's a huge question, is becoming familiar with God's voice. Familiarity. What's you wrote down the definition of familiarity? Is it down there?
Yeah.
We're looking.
Familiar by definition is to be close acquaintance with or knowledge of something, and the quality of being well known or recognize that thing based on knowledge. So it's basically, if you know what it is, if you have a deep understanding of who God is, then you're familiar with God.
I think in, what is it, 2 Samuel? Or no, it's in 1 Samuel. I don't remember where. You might need to edit this.
While he's looking for that, we're just going to... That's fine.
I got it. It's in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel, we see where Eli, the priest, is in the temple. He's an old man. He's laying down. And then Samuel, who is going to be the servant, and he's basically kind of takes care of... He's like an altar boy kind of thing. He's literally in the house of God, and God calls him 3 times, 3 specific times. He says, Samuel. And then Samuel will get up and he'd go running over to Eli and he'd be like, hey, master, you called me? And the old man's like, no, go back to bed. And I'm sure he probably thought the kid was getting crazy.
Yeah.
But the last time, Eli finally realizes, he's like, hey, Samuel, quit being a dummy. That's God. He's calling you. You know, and it said that Samuel had not yet become familiar with God's voice. That this was like the first time he had really started hearing him. And then later on, after this point, Samuel spends lots of time with God, constantly speaking with him, totally familiar with his voice, totally understanding everything that he says, and he becomes this prophet and doing all these things. But at the very beginning, it's funny because he had no idea. He's like, what? Who is that?
Yeah, who is this on the phone here?
And so we need to look at a few examples from this life of how we become familiar with God's voice. One, spending time in God's house is important. Spending time in that house. Is that the church? Sure. Is that other resources? Yeah. But spending time that is going to be directly associated with God.